Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Josie's Point of View, where we focus on human interest stories from the Carolinas and beyond. Today it's April the 24th, 2024. So it's 4/24/2024, an interesting day. But thank you so much for tuning in. If you're new to my channel, I want to thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you find the information here to be informative. And if you're a returning viewer, by all means, thank you for coming back. I always say the tide changes so frequently on these YouTube streets. So you always have to acknowledge where your support comes from. And I want you to know I sincerely thank you for your support. Feel free to like and to share this video. And don't forget to subscribe. And our story today comes from Fort Liberty here in North Carolina. Take a look at the headline. And it reads, Drug Trafficking in the Military, the Court-Martial of a Sergeant Major. Well, this is my second video addressing this topic. In the first video, pictured here, I covered the arrest and charges against the Sergeant Major, and we're not going back today. Our video today picks up where we left off. So if you're interested in gaining background information on this case, such as the how, when, why, what happened in the beginning, what we discussed, I would encourage you to review my first video. It's only 12.5 minutes long, and it will fill in some of the gaps for you. And as we move through today's video, even though I don't plan to revisit all information, I will, however, address areas where clarification on any aspect of the case or provide changes to what was previously mentioned in the past. Now, previously, I relied on second and third party information in developing my presentation to you, but this time it's different. I was there. I was sitting in that courtroom for the entire court martial. I was there from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. and I took lots of notes. So I feel comfortable sharing with you what I saw and what I heard. So let's go ahead and let's get started. And things don't always go as planned for me because in the beginning I had my days mixed up. So I showed up on Monday only to find the doors to the courtroom were locked. So I sat in my car for a while until a service member came by and clarified that I had the wrong day. That day, Monday was the 22nd, the case was scheduled for the 23rd. So I chuckled to myself, left, and returned the following day, which was Tuesday, April the 23rd. So once I got there, I was scanned through by military police personnel on duty and then escorted into the courtroom by a Marine captain who was at the door. And unknown to me, I walked over and I introduced myself to a captain seated in the front row, only to realize he was a defense attorney. And he was so accommodating, I just sat down behind him. Now, the sergeant major walked in shortly thereafter from a side door to the left, and he sat in the same row ahead of me in the middle of two defense attorneys. Now, he was dressed in his army dress blue uniform and he was clean cut as expected. Now, let's go back. He had two attorneys, one military, one civilian. And the civilian attorney, I'll share his name later, but he appeared to be the lead attorney because he did all of the talking and all of the coaching to the sergeant major throughout the case. And he was the person who questioned all of the witnesses. Now, on the opposite side was the prosecuting team, two female captains, and I noticed a bunch of people sitting behind them in the observation area. They were opposite to me. I couldn't understand why there's so many people over there, and I was in this opposite side sitting by myself. But I found out later on. So that's the way things were when we got started. Oh, another observation was that there were no panel members present. And that's unusual because there's a team of senior folks who would be prosecuting the court martial. But I soon realized in this case, things were going to be different. And here is my first point of clarification, and it has to do with the correct pronunciation of the Sergeant Major's name. Now, in my previous video, I said Sergeant Major George Garcia. Now, this should be corrected because the correct pronunciation, it should be Sergeant Major Jorge Garcia. And that's important for me because regardless of the spelling of an individual's name, it should be pronounced correctly. So it should be Sergeant Major Jorge Garcia. So we started on time, of course, and after the judge walked in, he gave a few remarks, and then clarified that there was an initial plea agreement, and because of some concerns from the teams, they now had a second plea agreement. And the sergeant major and his attorneys then clarified this new agreement with the stipulation of facts, not guilty on several items, but guilty on two specifications. The judge then asked the sergeant major how he wanted to be tried, and the sergeant major stated he wanted to be tried by the judge. So that's when really it became clear to me why there were no panel. There were no panel members because all of the decisions would be made by the judge. And then the judge asked the sergeant major if the stipulation of facts were true, if he had read it, and whether he had signed it, I should say. And the sergeant major responded yes to all questions. Then the judge told the sergeant major that since the sergeant major had already pled guilty, the judge needed to ask him a series of questions in order to substantiate that guilty plea. He said the sergeant major could consult with his attorneys before responding, but he needed to be specific with his responses. So let's review the discussions between the first guilty plea, which was the transport of illegal drugs, which was then verified to be 88.49 kilos of methamphetamine, and that transcribes to 195 pounds of the illegal substance. So the judge then asked the sergeant major to explain what he meant by a guilty plea. So the sergeant major began by saying his ex-girlfriend will identify her only as Miss M. He stated his ex-girlfriend told him about some illegal drugs in the truck and that he didn't know what type of drug it was. And then the judge pressed him about not knowing what type of drugs, but you could tell that the judge was not buying what he was saying because he kept saying that he didn't know. And finally, the judge said, and these are his exact words, I need you to be specific. Tell me all of the facts or we'll need to schedule a contested trial. Now, those were his exact words. So right there, the judge was threatening him with the withdrawal of that guilty plea, and then the sergeant major started over. The sergeant major then stated that his ex-girlfriend, Miss M, had asked him to drive a truck with illegal drugs across the border. And then the judge said, look me in the eye and tell me exactly what Miss M told you. And he began to explain. And then the judge asked him if he knew Miss M was actively involved in drug activity. I'm not sure of his response. I didn't write it down. I don't recall exactly, but the sergeant did said that Miss M had asked him to do her a favor. And after some more revelations, the judge asked him what he was to do with the drugs after he crossed over the border. And the sergeant major responded, she said she would be contacting me with further instruction. And then it got a bit more specific. The judge said, did you import illegal drugs across the border? He said, yes. He said, what border? He asked what border. The sergeant major told him. The judge said 88.49 kilos. Sergeant major said yes. Did you know it was a legal drug? The sergeant major said yes. Did you know it equals to 195 pounds? Sergeant major said yes. The judge asked, did you know it was meth? The sergeant major stated he thought it was cocaine and that there was some additional questions in order to get it to the point that the sergeant major knew it was meth. And he then clarified that he was not forced, it was a voluntary act, he was not threatened in any way, that he knew what he was doing was unlawful, and he responded yes to all of those questions. And then the judge asked him, did you know it was a controlled substance and that it was illegal to transport? And the sergeant major responded, yes, sir. And that's how the first guilty plea discussion went. The prosecution did not say anything. The only interaction was between the sergeant major, his civilian attorney, and then responding to the questions posed by the judge. And after a short break, the courtroom was back in session for discussion of guilty plea number 2, dereliction of duty. Essentially, it was proven that the sergeant major had made several trips outside of the United States for which he had not received approval or clearance, and those are mandatory requirements for all service members. And once again, the judge asked him to explain his guilty plea. the civilian attorney whispered something in his ear, and I probably could have heard what they were talking about, but I decided not to be nosy. And then the sergeant major began, but I'm not sure how long that conversation ended. I didn't write it down. But then the judge began with a series of questions. Now, the judge stated, any soldier who has been in the Army for any length of time knows that certain steps are necessary for travel, especially travel outside the United States. Do you know what those steps are? Sergeant Major said yes. The judge then explained to me what the steps were, and then the sergeant major began to explain. The judge said, did you follow those steps? The sergeant major said he did not. The judge, did you start, but did you just not finish? The sergeant major said he had not followed them. Why do you think those steps are necessary? The sergeant major said, for safety reasons. The judge said also for accountability reasons, and the sergeant major said yes. The judge, did you coordinate? Were you told it was okay? The sergeant major said no. So there was some discussion between both teams about where he went and when we went. But essentially, that was the end of the interaction between the sergeant major and the judge regarding his guilty plea. It took a lot longer. I'm just going through a little bit faster. But by this time, the sergeant major's daughter and a male companion had entered the courtroom, and they sat next to me on the front row. And then the conversation shifted to the prosecution team on the opposite side of the room. It was their turn to address the court. The member of the team spoke to the judge about the recommended maximum sentence based on the plea agreement, reduction in grade to E1, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, dishonorable discharge, and 5 years of confinement. That's what the prosecution team wanted, but the defense team had a different take, and I'll go over that in a few minutes. And after that interaction with the judge, there was some back and forth about the revised plea agreement. And finally, the judge confirmed with the sergeant major that he was aware of the plea agreement, that he had read it, and that he had signed it. The judge also asked him if he was satisfied with his representation and if he had any questions. And then, based on his response, the judge told him he would be accepting the plea agreement. But the judge also told him that the charges to which he pled not guilty, that those charges were going to be dismissed with prejudice, and the judge went over what that meant, that he could never be charged for them in the future. And right before lunch, the prosecution team called their only witness, a special agent from the Department of Homeland Security, who was also a drug enforcement officer and a customs officer from the border area where the drugs were confiscated. I believe he specialized in financial and drug crimes. And he spoke about the wholesale as well as the street value of the drugs they had confiscated. He mentioned a wholesale value of around $800,000, but did mention that the street value could be as high as $1 million to $2.1 million. Nonetheless, they settled on a value of $800,000. And after that, the prosecution team rested their case, and we were excused for lunch. But as we were leaving, the sergeant major's daughter came up to me, extended her hand, and introduced herself, and told me she was available if I had questions, but I decided to leave her alone. Now, I mentioned earlier that there were a lot of people sitting behind the defense team, and there were even more in the lobby. I found out they were military police, some in uniform, many in civilian attire, but they had their guns, and some were even wearing vests. Whatever was anticipated, they were definitely prepared, but there was a whole lot of them. I actually stood in the lobby and I started counting. There were so many. I think there were at least 8 or 9 on with the civilian attire, and there are about 7 or 8 in their military uniform. There were just lots of them. But I also realized many of them were guarding the prisoner. Regardless of how calm things seemed on the inside of the courtroom, there was still a prisoner, and they were definitely doing their job. So now it was after lunch, and it was the defense team. their time to call the witnesses, and they had several, including the sergeant major who took the stand. And with the exception of the sergeant major and one other individual, the witnesses were out of state, so telephone interviews were done. Now, this was one part I really did not appreciate because it was difficult to hear what the witnesses were saying, even on the speakerphone. And the constant opening and closing of the entrance door to the courtroom was a big distraction for me. That's just me. That's the only thing about this entire trial I really didn't care for. Now, they started off with the sergeant major's ex-wife. They had been married for 22 years, and of course, they are now divorced. She described him as a caring father who was always very supportive and very active in the lives of his three daughters. I won't mention what else she said, but it was all positive. And as she spoke, the sergeant major's daughter, who was sitting right next to me, she began to cry. I felt so bad. Now, I would have liked to reach out and at least hug her, but I had to revert back to military protocol. I had to acknowledge her, but I kept looking straight ahead. And after the ex-wife, all of the other witnesses were former colleagues who had served from the sergeant major previously. Now, defense asked all of them the same questions: how long they had known him, what type of interactions they had with him, when was the last time they interacted, how would they assess his character, did they view him as being resilient, and considering that he had pled guilty to transporting drugs and dereliction of duty, did they feel the sergeant major could be a productive member of society. Now, all of the witnesses spoke very highly of the sergeant major, but one individual tried to minimize the crimes. But he said the sergeant major had committed a small infraction. Now, that didn't go over well with the prosecution team, and they got him to admit that he had spoken out of turn, well, that he had chosen the wrong words. And finally, the sergeant major, he was the last witness. He took the stand. Now, he was guided by his attorney, and he spoke about his childhood, his parents, his marriage, his military career, which included places he had been, things he had experienced, being shot at, and the different wars, he had been through. As expected, his daughter was crying once more, and I felt a little bit choked up as well. You all spoke about injuries and the medical concerns that had developed because of his military service. Now, I won't mention any medical problems. That's a matter, I think it's a personal matter, and I refuse to share it out of respect for him. And after about 10 minutes of dialogue, the attorney said, "Your family is here. Is there anything you'd like to say?" And this was a time for acknowledgement and remorse. The sergeant major stated he had exercised poor judgment. He also said, "One stupid decision carried out." He said, "I have dishonored my family and my unit." And you can imagine his daughter was crying again, and I was close to tears myself. And that's when I stopped writing. I just could no longer focus. I needed a few minutes to regroup, but that's the last thing I heard. And he was the last witness for the defense. And closing arguments did not take very long. The prosecution went first. The prosecuting attorney stated that the sergeant major had violated his oath and had abused the privileges granted to him as a seasoned military leader. They emphasized that he was granted special exemptions for crossing the border and that he capitalized on those privileges in order to transport illegal drugs, lots of drugs, in the bed of his red pickup truck. They stated a few more things, but they concluded by asking the judge to impose the maximum sentence from the plea agreement. Apparently, all but the confinement time had been given, and they were not going to be waived, but they were asking for the maximum of 5 years of confinement with credit for time already served. Now, the defense team had a different take. He was asking the judge to impose 2 years of confinement, saying that forfeiture of pay and benefits was already a powerful message to send. He said it would equate to over $1 million in lost revenue over the sergeant major's lifetime, and that in itself was already a powerful message. He said he did not believe additional confinement would make more of a difference, so he was asking the judge to impose a maximum of 2 years, and then the courtroom was placed on break as the judge prepared to deliver his decision. And shortly thereafter, we returned to the courtroom to hear the judge's final decision. Now, the judge's words were brief and to the point. He said he asked Sergeant Major and his team to stand for his decision. I noticed his daughter holding the hands of her companion, and the room was just very, very quiet. You could hear a pin drop. And then the judge spoke in the same calm voice that he had maintained throughout the trial. He said, Sergeant Major Jorge Garcia, I sentence you to 52 months of confinement. Now, it was already understood that there would be additional aspects of the plea agreement that would be imposed. For example, a dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and a reduction in grade to E1. And then the judge asked both teams whether his sentence were within the guidelines or the terms of the plea agreement, and all of them responded in the affirmative. Then we all stood as this judge exited the room. Now the sergeant major reached back, he turned back and reached back, and he hugged his daughter and said goodbye, and I quickly walked out of the room. As I was walking back to my car, as I was walking down the steps, I noticed a white minivan and realized it was the prisoner transported was right next to that handicap spot. You can see the tip of it there. So I asked a few questions and confirmed that the sergeant major would be walking out this front entrance. He would be walking down those very steps. So I said, well, this is a chance for me. I then decided I would wait for the opportunity to take a picture while I was sitting inside of my car, and that's exactly what I did. So let me share that with you. I waited until the sergeant major's daughter had left because I did not want her to be in any picture. And then the first to come out were the defense attorneys, the civilian and the military attorney, and I just captured them at different points as they were walking down the stairs, and they just walked through those cross lines, looked at me and smiled, and walked on over to their vehicle. Now, I enlarged this photo as much as I could, but you can see coming down the stairs, there are two military police, one in uniform and one in civilian attire with his guns. You can see it right there. But the one in the military uniform is holding the sergeant major's military dress uniform because the sergeant major obviously had to change back into his BUs. And if you look at the entrance, you see two police MPs on guard, and then you see the sergeant major in the middle, and there are two MPs assisting him. His hands he's in handcuff, and they are apparently attaching some type of restraint to the back of his BDU by his waist. I could not tell if he was shackles. To me he wasn't, but I couldn't tell, so I'm not going to say something that I don't know. But this is as he was at the front entrance preparing to walk down the stairs. And as the sergeant major and the team began walking down the stairs, the passenger van just pulled up in front of me because they wanted to be right there at the entrance. If you look closely at this picture, you can see the MP with his uniform to the right. And if you look up at the top, look how many and military police are with the sergeant major. There are 2, 3, 4, and another one behind him. There are a total of 5 police escorting him down the stairs. But this is as he was beginning to walk down again towards the van. And at this point, he's closer to the van. There wasn't much to see. It would have been so disrespectful to me to go out there and try to take photos. I'm glad I made a decision to sit in my car. And I'm glad when this was taking place, I'm glad that his family, they had already left. So this is the last photo of what happened that day. And that's all I have for you right now, but feel free to leave me a comment below and let me know what you think about this video, and by all means, feel free to like it and to share it. And if you haven't done so already, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel by clicking on that red subscribe button. It's on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if you click on the bell that looks like just like this one, that's the notification bell. If you click on that notification bell, you'll be the first to know whenever a new video is uploaded. I thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.